The strange thing about funerals is how quiet they are on the surface. Everyone speaks softly. Everyone moves carefully. Everyone pretends grief is the only thing in the room. But sometimes grief isn't the loudest emotion there. Sometimes the loudest thing is memory. And sometimes memory sits beside something much darker, greed. I realized that the moment I stepped out of the car. The old house stood exactly the way I remembered it. The same white columns, the same wide porch, the same oak tree that had shaded 3 generations of our family. And the same people standing under it. Only now they were dressed in black. For a moment I stayed in the car, my hand still resting on the steering wheel. 10 years. 10 years since I had last stood in this driveway. 10 years since I had last spoken to some of the people waiting near the porch steps. 10 years since everything in this family had broken. Now the man who held us together was gone. My grandfather, Arthur Caldwell. To the town, he had been a respected businessman. To the church, he had been a generous donor. To the neighbors, he had been the man who always waved first. But to us, his family, he had been something more complicated. He had been the center. The one person whose presence kept certain things from falling apart. And now he was gone. I stepped out of the car. Immediately, conversation slowed. That was the first thing I noticed. Not silence exactly, but the subtle shift that happens when people suddenly become aware of someone entering a room they weren't expecting. Or maybe someone they were hoping wouldn't come. My cousin Daniel was the first to spot me. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Then he forced a smile. "Well," he said as he walked toward me, hands in his pockets, "look who finally came back." The tone was light. Friendly, even. But there was something behind it. Something tight. "Daniel," I said. We shook hands. His grip lingered just a second longer than normal. A small reminder. We both remembered. Behind him, several other relatives stood watching. My Aunt Rebecca. My Uncle Thomas. 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. All of them dressed in black. All of them smiling carefully. As if rehearsing the role of a loving family. "Grandfather would have been glad you came," Rebecca said gently. Her voice sounded kind. But I had heard that same voice before. Years ago. In a hospital hallway. Saying something very different. "Of course I came," I said. Because no matter what had happened between the rest of us, Arthur Caldwell had deserved better than family politics. He had deserved respect. Daniel nodded toward the house. "Everyone's inside," he said. The front door was open. Inside, people moved quietly through the rooms, speaking in low voices. Flowers covered nearly every surface. White lilies. Soft roses. The scent filled the house. But beneath it was something familiar. Old wood. Books. The faint smell of my grandfather's pipe tobacco that seemed permanently woven into the walls. For a moment, I stood in the doorway. And suddenly, I wasn't 40 years old anymore. I was 12. Running down that hallway. Hearing my grandfather's laugh from the study. Watching him sit behind the big oak desk while explaining how a contract worked. "Business isn't about money," he had told me once. "It's about character." At the time, I hadn't fully understood what he meant. Later, I would. Painfully. "Alex." I turned. The family lawyer stood near the dining room entrance. Mr. Whitmore. He had handled my grandfather's legal affairs for more than 20 years. He looked older than I remembered. "Tired?" "Mr. Whitmore," I said. He nodded politely. "I'm glad you made it." There was something unusual in the way he said it. Almost like relief. Before I could respond, Rebecca's voice floated across the room. "We should all gather soon," she said. "The service begins in 20 minutes." People began moving toward the living room. Chairs had been arranged in rows. At the front stood a large photograph of my grandfather. He was smiling in the picture. The same calm smile I remembered from childhood. The kind of smile that made people believe everything would always stay the same. I sat near the back. From there, I could see nearly everyone. My cousins whispered to each other. Daniel leaned back casually in his chair. Rebecca dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Thomas checked his phone briefly before slipping it back into his pocket. Grief was present, but it wasn't alone. I could feel it. The quiet calculation in the room. Because funerals in families like ours are never only about loss. They're about what comes after. Inheritance. Control. Legacy. And everyone in that room knew it. The service itself passed in a blur of familiar rituals. Prayers. Memories. Stories about my grandfather's generosity. His work ethic. His wisdom. All true, but incomplete. Because the man in that photograph had also spent the final years of his life watching his family slowly divide itself over money. Over property. Over a future none of them had earned yet. And I had been there when it started. 8 years earlier. The hospital room had smelled like antiseptic and quiet fear. Grandfather lay in bed, thinner than I had ever seen him. The heart attack had taken more from him than anyone expected. Not just strength. Authority. For the first time in decades, people believed he might not recover. And that's when the conversations began. Not in front of him. Never directly. But in hallways. In quiet corners. In conversations that stopped the moment I walked in. Daniel had been the first to speak openly. "We need to start thinking about the estate," he had said one afternoon. Rebecca nodded. Thomas agreed. The reasoning sounded responsible. Practical. But there was something underneath it. Urgency. A hunger that hadn't existed before. Grandfather is still alive, I had reminded them. Daniel shrugged. Exactly why we should get things organized. Later that evening, Rebecca approached me privately. "You're close to him," she said softly. "Yes. You should talk to him." "About what?" She hesitated just long enough. "About updating the will." I remember the exact moment something inside me shifted. Because the way she said wasn't about protecting him. It was about protecting themselves. "Why?" I asked. "Because things change," she replied. But the truth was simpler. They wanted more. More control. More property. More money. And they believed the old man, weak, recovering, grateful for family attention, might be persuaded. They were wrong about one thing. Grandfather wasn't weak. He was watching. Listening. Learning. But they didn't realize that yet. Over the next few weeks, the pressure increased. Conversations turned into suggestions. Suggestions turned into plans. Plans turned into documents. Drafts of proposed updates. All carefully designed. All benefiting the same people. And eventually, they asked me to help. "You're the one he trusts," Daniel said one evening. "If you bring it up, he'll listen." "What exactly do you want me to say?" I asked. Daniel smiled slightly. "Just explain that restructuring the estate now would make things easier later." It sounded reasonable. But the subtext was clear. Convince him. Before he recovers enough to think clearly. I refused. That moment changed everything. Because suddenly, I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle. The following weeks became tense. Cold conversations. Quiet hostility. Eventually, I left the house altogether. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just quietly. Because I refused to participate in something that felt like betrayal. I moved away. built my own life, started my own business. And for years, I had no contact with most of them until the call came 3 days ago. Grandfather had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Now I was back, sitting in the living room, listening to people praise the man they had once tried to manipulate. When the service ended, people slowly began moving outside. The burial would take place at the family cemetery, a mile down the road. I stepped onto the porch. Daniel joined me a few seconds later. "You've been quiet," he said. "It's a funeral." He chuckled. "Still the moral compass, huh?" I looked at him. Somebody has to be. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned against the railing, watching guests walk toward their cars. "Look," he said finally. "That whole thing years ago, we were just trying to be practical." "Practical? Yes. Is that what you call it?" He sighed. "You're still holding on to that." I didn't answer. Because forgiveness is a strange thing. People often confuse it with forgetting. They assume time erases everything. But time doesn't erase. It clarifies. Across the yard, Mr. Whitmore stood speaking with my Uncle Thomas. The lawyer's expression looked strained, uneasy. Something about it caught my attention. After the burial, everyone returned to the house for the reception. Food covered the dining table. Guests moved through the rooms sharing memories. The atmosphere slowly shifted from grief to conversation. But beneath it all, something else lingered. Expectation. I overheard Daniel speaking with another cousin. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly. "So soon?" she asked. Whitmore insisted. "Good," she replied. "I'm ready to see how everything turned out." How everything turned out. Not if. How. They sounded confident. Certain. I watched Mr. Whitmore again. He sat alone near the window, reviewing a folder. Several documents were inside. Thick ones. Official ones. When our eyes met, he hesitated. Then he stood and walked toward me. "Alex," he said quietly. "Yes. We'll be meeting tomorrow morning." I heard. He nodded. 10 o'clock. In your office?" "Yes." He paused, as if deciding whether to say something else. "Your grandfather made several decisions near the end," he said carefully. "Important ones." "What kind of decisions?" "I think it's best discussed tomorrow." That was when I realized something. Mr. Whitmore wasn't nervous about family arguments. He was nervous about the outcome. Across the room, Daniel laughed loudly at something Rebecca said. They looked relaxed, confident, certain that tomorrow would simply confirm what they had always expected. An inheritance divided exactly the way they had planned years ago. But something about Whitmore's expression suggested otherwise. And suddenly, for the first time since arriving, I wondered if my grandfather had seen everything. The manipulation, the pressure, the quiet betrayal. And if he had, what had he done about it? Later that evening, as guests began leaving, Rebecca approached me again. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Thank you." She lowered her voice slightly. "I hope tomorrow goes smoothly." "So do I. Families shouldn't fight over things like this." I studied her face. The same calm expression she had worn in that hospital hallway years earlier. Pretending concern. Masking calculation. "You're right," I said. "They shouldn't." She smiled. Relieved. As if believing that meant forgiveness. But forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. And tomorrow, the truth would finally surface. Near the door, Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat to get everyone's attention. "Before everyone leaves," he said, "I want to confirm tomorrow's meeting." The room quieted. The reading of Arthur Caldwell's will take place at my office at 10 a.m. Several people nodded. Daniel folded his arms confidently. Rebecca looked satisfied. Thomas whispered something to his wife. Mr. Whitmore continued. All immediate family members should attend. He paused, then added one final sentence. A few matters may come as unexpected. The room went still, just for a moment. Then Daniel laughed. Well, he said lightly, I'm sure Grandpa didn't leave any surprises. But Mr. Whitmore didn't smile, and something in my chest tightened. Because suddenly, tomorrow didn't feel like a routine inheritance meeting anymore. It felt like the beginning of something else. A reckoning none of them were prepared for. Morning arrived with a kind of stillness that felt deceptive. The town looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet streets, slow traffic, sunlight touching the rooftops like nothing had changed. But inside the law office on Main Street, everything was about to change. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. Grandfather had always said that people reveal their character in small things, how they treat others, how they keep promises, and whether they respect time. Mr. Whitmore's office sat on the second floor of a brick building that had been there longer than any of us. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The receptionist greeted me quietly and pointed toward the conference room. Mr. Whitmore is finishing a call, she said. You can go ahead and wait. I stepped inside. The room was large but simple. A long wooden table stretched across the center, surrounded by chairs that had probably witnessed decades of legal decisions. On the far wall hung a framed photograph of the town from 50 years ago. Grandfather's first hardware store was visible in the picture. I stared at it for a moment. That store had been the beginning of everything. The business, the land, the investments. The fortune people in my family were now quietly calculating. Footsteps approached in the hallway. The door opened. Daniel walked in first. He looked confident. Too confident. Morning, he said casually. Morning. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me, leaning back comfortably. You beat everyone here, he said. I arrived early. He smirked slightly. Still disciplined. I didn't respond. Within a few minutes, the others began arriving. Rebecca entered next, dressed carefully in a gray suit that suggested professionalism rather than mourning. Uncle Thomas followed, already talking about something on his phone. Two cousins came in whispering excitedly. The room slowly filled. And with every new arrival, the same quiet energy grew stronger. Expectation. Not grief. Not reflection. Expectation. Daniel tapped his fingers lightly on the table. So, he said, glancing around the room, anyone want to guess how things are divided? Rebecca gave him a subtle look. Daniel. What? He said lightly. We all know why we're here. One of the cousins laughed. I heard the lake property alone is worth almost $5 million now. Thomas nodded. And the company shares. That's the real prize, Daniel said. I watched them talk. Watched the excitement in their voices. Watched the future they had already spent in their minds. New houses. New cars. Business ventures. Freedom. The strange thing was how certain they sounded. As if the outcome had already been decided years ago. In a way, maybe they believed it had. Rebecca looked at me. You've been quiet, she said. I'm listening. Well, she said gently, whatever happens, we should remember we're still family. Family. It was a word that sounded different depending on who used it. To some people, it meant loyalty. To others, it meant opportunity. Before I could respond, the door opened again. Mr. Whitmore entered carrying a thick folder. The room immediately quieted. He closed the door behind him. Then he sat at the head of the table, "Good morning," he said. No one responded immediately. Everyone was watching the folder. Whitmore opened it slowly. "I understand this is a difficult time," he began. His voice was calm but formal. "Arthur Caldwell's passing marks the end of an extraordinary life and legacy." Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Whitmore continued. "As his attorney for more than 2 decades, I can confirm that Mr. Caldwell took his estate planning very seriously." Rebecca nodded politely. "He reviewed and updated his will several times over the years to ensure his intentions remained clear." The word "updated" seemed to land in the room like a small stone dropped in water. I noticed Daniel glance at Rebecca. Whitmore continued. "The document I will read today represents the final version of Mr. Caldwell's will." He paused. "Signed and legally recorded 3 weeks before his passing." The room was completely silent now. Whitmore unfolded the first page. "I will begin." The legal language came first. Formalities. Dates. Verification of witnesses. Standard procedures that filled the first few minutes. But even in those opening paragraphs, something unusual appeared. Assets were being described in greater detail than I expected. Properties. Investments. Company holdings. And then, the distribution section began. Whitmore cleared his throat slightly. "To my beloved family, I leave not only my estate but the responsibility that comes with it." The wording sounded personal, not purely legal. Daniel leaned forward. Whitmore continued reading. "My life has taught me that wealth does not test character nearly as much as the opportunity to gain it." The room grew very still. Rebecca frowned slightly. Whitmore kept reading. "In my later years, I have had the rare opportunity to observe the true nature of those closest to me." Daniel's posture stiffened. Whitmore turned the page. "During my illness several years ago, I witnessed both compassion and calculation." The silence in the room deepened. "Some members of my family demonstrated patience, kindness, and respect for my independence." Another pause. "Others saw my weakness as an opportunity to shape my legacy to their advantage." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's jaw tightened. Whitmore continued. "I forgive those actions, but forgiveness does not erase truth." I felt something in my chest tighten. Whitmore looked up briefly. Then he read the next line. "For that reason, I have made several changes to the structure of my estate." Daniel spoke suddenly. "What kind of changes?" Whitmore raised a hand gently. "Please allow me to continue." Daniel leaned back again, but his confidence had faded slightly. Whitmore read the next section. "The majority of my estate, including controlling shares of Caldwell Holdings, the lake property, and the primary real estate portfolio, will be placed under the supervision of my appointed executor." The room leaned forward collectively. Daniel looked almost eager now. Whitmore turned another page. "I appoint my grandson, Alexander Caldwell, as executor and controlling beneficiary of the estate." The sentence seemed to echo in the room. No one spoke. For several seconds, the silence was absolute. Then, "That's not possible," Daniel said. Whitmore continued reading. "Alexander has demonstrated the one quality necessary to protect what I built: integrity." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "This must be some mistake." Whitmore kept reading. "He refused to manipulate me when others attempted to do so. He refused to take advantage of my illness when it would have been easy." Thomas leaned forward. "You're saying he gets everything?" Whitmore finally looked up. "No." But the answer didn't calm anyone. "Alexander will act as executor and controlling beneficiary responsible for managing the estate and enforcing the conditions outlined in this will." Daniel slammed his hand lightly on the table. "What conditions?" Whitmore flipped to another page. Several assets are distributed among family members, he said. But those distributions are conditional. Rebecca spoke sharply. Conditional how? Whitmore read. Any legal challenge to the authority of the executor will result in the forfeiture of that individual's inheritance. The room erupted. That's insane. This is manipulation. He planned this. Daniel pointed directly at me. You did this. I didn't move. You convinced him. Whitmore spoke firmly. Mr. Caldwell made these decisions independently. Bull! Daniel stopped himself, glancing toward Rebecca. Rebecca leaned forward. This doesn't make sense. Whitmore slid a document across the table. It may help to hear Mr. Caldwell's own explanation. Rebecca picked it up. Her hands trembled slightly. What is this? A written statement your grandfather asked me to include with the will. Daniel snatched it from her. He read silently for several seconds. Then his face turned pale. What does it say? Thomas asked. Daniel looked at me. Then he read aloud. If you're hearing this now, it means the truth I observed has finally become clear. He stopped. His voice sounded different now. Less confident. My family believes forgiveness means forgetting. The words felt like they were written directly into the air. But forgiveness without memory is simply permission for the same betrayal to happen again. Daniel lowered the page. That's ridiculous. Whitmore spoke quietly. Please continue. Daniel swallowed. I watched how each of you behaved when I was weak. He paused again. Some of you offered comfort. Some offered patience. And some offered paperwork. Rebecca stood suddenly. This is absurd. But Daniel kept reading. Alexander was the only one who refused to treat my illness as a negotiation. The room had gone silent again. Integrity is rare, especially when money is involved. Daniel dropped the paper onto the table. You expect us to believe this? Whitmore spoke calmly. The will is legally valid. Thomas leaned forward angrily. So he controls everything. Whitmore nodded. Alexander oversees the estate and ensures the conditions are followed. Daniel stared at me. You're enjoying this? No, I said quietly. Then say something. The entire room looked at me now. Expectation had turned into accusation. Anger. Fear. I took a breath. When grandfather was sick, I said, you all asked me to convince him to change the will. Rebecca's face hardened. That's not. I refused. Daniel scoffed. You're acting like you're some kind of hero. No, I said. I just refused to betray him. Thomas slammed his hand on the table. This is revenge. I shook my head slowly. If it were revenge, none of you would receive anything. Whitmore confirmed. The will distributes significant assets to each of you. Daniel laughed bitterly. Under his control. Yes. Rebecca stared at me. So what now? I looked around the room. At the same people who had once stood in a hospital hallway, discussing how to reshape an old man's legacy. At this moment, I said, nothing changes. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means you receive exactly what grandfather intended. And if we challenge this? Whitmore answered calmly. Your inheritance disappears. Silence. Heavy. Final. Daniel leaned back slowly. Rebecca stared at the table. Thomas looked furious. But none of them spoke. Because for the first time since walking into that room, they understood something. They had expected the future to belong to them. But the man they underestimated had been watching the entire time. And in the end, he chose integrity over greed. Whitmore closed the folder. That concludes the reading. Chairs scraped the floor. Rebecca stood and walked toward the door without another word. Thomas followed. Daniel remained, seated a moment longer. Then he looked at me. This isn't over. I met his gaze calmly. It never was. He stood and left. Soon the room was empty. Only Whitmore and I remained. He sighed quietly. Your grandfather trusted you. I know. He believed you would protect what he built. I looked at the folder on the table. For years, my family had believed time would erase the past. But character doesn't disappear. It simply waits for the moment it's tested. And today, that moment had finally arrived. Whitmore handed me the folder. Executor Caldwell, he said. The title felt heavier than any inheritance. But as I walked out of the office, I realized something important. Grandfather hadn't given me power. He had given me responsibility. Responsibility to protect the one thing our family almost lost. Integrity.